October 14, 1943, 15,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Inside the cramped cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190, the only sounds are the engine's drone and the scratch of a pencil on worn leather. A German fighter pilot calmly records his 17th heavy bomber destroyed, another B-17 flying fortress, now just a funeral pyre of black smoke spiraling desperately toward the earth. Through his canopy, he watches the remaining American bombers struggle to hold their formation, their gunners spraying useless streams of .50 caliber rounds into an empty sky where his squadron had been only moments before. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, this was the simple, brutal mathematics of aerial combat. They called it a turkey shoot. The Americans had a different name for this day, Black Thursday. They believed their flying fortresses were invincible. The German pilots knew they were just expensive targets, and they laughed. The American theory of daylight strategic bombing was built on a single, audacious belief that their B-17 flying fortresses could defend themselves. But over Germany, this theory was colliding with a brutal reality. The target on October 14th was Schweinfurt, home to the ball-bearing factories that were the lifeblood of the German war machine. That morning, 291 B-17s crossed into enemy airspace. By sunset, 60 had been shot from the sky, with another 17 so critically damaged they would be written off after landing. The human cost was even more staggering. In a single day, over 600 American airmen were killed or captured. The 8th Air Force was being bled white. They called it Black Thursday, the darkest day in their history. Deep penetration raids were immediately suspended, and the entire American air strategy in Europe was on the verge of complete and catastrophic failure. The flying fortress, it turned out, was a myth. On paper, the American combat box formation, a three-dimensional pattern of up to 21 bombers, should have been a fortress of overlapping fire. Each B-17 bristled with 13.50 caliber machine guns, theoretically covering every angle of approach. But German pilots weren't fighting on paper. They had refined the interception of these formations into a cold, hard science, turning the bomber's strengths into fatal weaknesses. They had identified critical flaws, blind spots in the nose, the gunner's limited ammunition, and most importantly, the psychological terror of a perfectly executed, high-speed attack. Aces like Heinz Nock perfected the head-on pass, an audacious maneuver that exploited the B-17's weakest defensive position. Approaching from 12 o'clock high, they would dive through the formation at 400 miles per hour, fire a devastating 2-second burst into the cockpit, and break away before the top turret gunners could even react. Other units, led by commanders like Major Graf, developed the terrifying company front attack, 8 fighters approaching line abreast, deliberately saturating the bomber's defensive fire with multiple, simultaneous targets. For an American gunner, the psychological impact was devastating. Facing 8 fighters closing at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour, he had seconds to choose a target and, in his panic, often shot at nothing at all. The fundamental question, then, was simple: where were the American fighters? The answer is that they were trying, but they were failing. The primary escort, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, was a beast, heavily armed and tough, but critically thirsty. Even with external drop tanks, its combat radius was a mere 375 miles, barely enough to reach the German border before its fuel ran low. The twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning had longer legs, but it was a fragile thoroughbred in the brutal European cold. At high altitudes, its engines sputtered and failed, and its controls would freeze solid, making it a death trap for its own pilots. This fatal limitation created a deadly ritual. The Allied escorts would fly to the very edge of their range, tragically waggle their wings in farewell, and turn for home. For the Luftwaffe pilots waiting just beyond, this was what they called the golden moment. They would track the bomber streams on radar, calculating the exact point the little friends would be forced to leave. The moment they did, the wolves would pounce on the flock, leaving the bombers to face the heart of Germany, completely and utterly alone. The solution to America's crisis wouldn't come from an American military plan, but from a transatlantic gamble born of British desperation. The story began in April 1940, when the British Purchasing Commission, fighting for survival against the Luftwaffe, approached a young company called North American Aviation. Their request was simple: build more P-40 Warhawk fighters for them under license. But the company's leadership made an audacious counteroffer. Instead of building another company's aging design, they argued they could create something entirely new, something far better. They then made a promise that was almost unbelievable in an industry where development took years. They could take a brand new fighter from a blank sheet of paper to a flying prototype in just 120 days. It was a staggering claim. The British, desperate for any advantage, agreed. The gamble was on, and the clock was ticking. North American had delivered a masterpiece of an airframe, but it had a fatal flaw. The early Mustang was powered by an American Allison engine, a power plant that performed brilliantly at low altitudes but was anemic above 15,000 20,000 feet. It left the fighter gasping for air precisely where the bombers flew, making it just another flawed savior. But the aircraft's destiny would be transformed by an unlikely marriage of American and British engineering. In April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew the Allison-powered Mustang and had a revelation. The airframe, he reported, was superb, aerodynamically cleaner than even the Spitfire. What it needed was a better engine. His solution was simple yet revolutionary. Fit the Mustang with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage, supercharged engine that powered the latest Spitfires. The results of the first test flight were extraordinary. Maximum speed jumped from 390 to 440 miles per hour. More importantly, its performance above 20,000 feet went from marginal to exceptional, and its service ceiling leaped to a staggering 42,000 feet. The perfect airframe had finally met its perfect engine. The Merlin engine gave the Mustang its high-altitude power, but it was a different secret that gave it its incredible range. The designers at North American had solved the physics of long-distance flight with two key innovations that made the P-51 the most efficient fighter in the sky. The first was its revolutionary laminar flow wing. A conventional aircraft wing creates significant turbulence as it moves, causing drag that wastes fuel. The Mustang's wing, however, was engineered to maintain smooth or laminar airflow across the vast majority of its surface, allowing it to slice through the air with unmatched efficiency. This design alone reduced drag by nearly 30%. The result was stunning. While a P-47 Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons of fuel per hour, the Mustang sipped just 65 at the same speed. The second secret was the ability to carry a massive fuel load without a major performance penalty. Combined with its internal tanks, external drop tanks stretched the Mustang's combat radius to an astonishing 850 miles, more than enough to fly all the way to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and escort the bombers safely home. With the perfect weapon now built, the question was who would wield it first. That honor fell to the 354th Fighter Group, quickly nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group. In November 1943, these pilots were ordered to trade in their tough, dependable P-47 Thunderbolts for this new and proven machine. They were the pioneers, and their lives depended on this gamble paying off. The moment they climbed into the cockpit, they knew. The contrast was immediate and electrifying. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, who flew one of the first orientation flights, captured the feeling perfectly. "The moment I lifted off, I knew we had something special," he recalled. The Mustang handled like a sports car compared to the truck-like Thunderbolt. It was responsive, fast, and most importantly, it could fly forever. The pioneers had found their steed. For the first time, American pilots had a fighter as nimble as it was lethal, with the range to finally take the war to the enemy's doorstep. In December 1943, the pioneers were unleashed. The true test came on December 13th, with a long-range escort mission to the port of Kiel, 490 miles from base, deep into territory previously impossible for Allied fighters to reach. For the waiting Luftwaffe pilots, it began as a routine hunt. They circled like sharks, watching the familiar P-47 escorts reach their limit and turn for home, just as they always did. They prepared to pounce on the now defenseless bombers. But something was wrong. Another group of fighters, sleek and unfamiliar, simply kept going. German pilots, mistaking them for Thunderbolts, waited for them to turn back. But when the Mustangs flew straight past the P-47's maximum range, confusion turned to alarm. Intercepted German radio chatter told the story of their disbelief. Controllers repeatedly demanded their pilots confirm what they were seeing, unable to process that Allied fighters were over their own cities. The ghosts were real. In a single afternoon, the sanctuary of the Reich had vanished forever. The shock that began in the air over Kiel quickly rippled up the Luftwaffe's chain of command. The true strategic nightmare became clear on December 30th, when Major Klaus Mayatusch, a veteran commander, led his fighters against a bomber stream. This time, the Mustangs didn't just escort, they hunted. They pursued his squadron relentlessly, hounding them all the way back to their own airfield as they tried to land. Shaken, Mayatusch gathered his pilots after the mission and delivered a chilling assessment. "The air war has fundamentally changed," he told them. "Our sanctuary no longer exists." That single word, sanctuary, was everything. The entire German air defense strategy, the location of their training fields, their factories, their assembly areas, was built on the assumption that the heart of Germany was safe from enemy fighters. With the arrival of the Mustang, that sanctuary was now a hunting ground. The war was no longer at the front lines. It was everywhere. With the Luftwaffe's sanctuary shattered, Allied command aimed for the one target that mattered above all others. It was a target that was less a factory and more a symbol, the capital of the Reich, the black heart of Nazi Germany. Berlin. This was the city that Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering had personally guaranteed would remain untouched. If an enemy bomber ever flies over Berlin, he had famously boasted to the German people, "You can call me Meyer." On March 4, 1944, a force of 660 heavy bombers took off with their escorts to make him a liar. Leading the charge on the historic 1,100-mile round trip was the legendary 4th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Donald Blakesley. In a stunning display of confidence in their new weapon, they were flying P-51s they had received only 4 days earlier. This wasn't just another bombing raid. It was a psychological sledgehammer, a mission designed to demolish the myth of German invincibility before the eyes of its leaders. The impossible mission was on. For the Luftwaffe pilots scrambling into the sky, the sight was incomprehensible. They had been told this was impossible, yet there they were, hundreds of American bombers, shielded by scores of fighters, directly over their capital. The Luftwaffe committed over 200 fighters to defend Berlin, but they weren't rising to meet weary bomber gunners. They were met by fresh, aggressive Mustang pilots diving on them from above. In the savage dogfights that followed, a shocking new reality became clear. The roles were completely reversed. The German defenders, having just scrambled from their bases, were the ones running low on fuel. The American attackers, after a 500-mile flight, were the ones with fuel to burn. The Mustang pilots were relentless. As Ace Captain Donald Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group described, the Mustang gave them everything: speed to catch any German fighter, maneuverability to dogfight them, and the range to do it anywhere the bombers went. German attacks were shattered before they could even get close. The psychological demolition of Berlin had begun. The shockwaves from the Berlin raid hit the Luftwaffe high command like a physical blow, triggering an immediate crisis. At the center of it was the architect of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, who at first flatly refused to believe the reports from his pilots. Only when confronted with undeniable proof, gun camera footage clearly showing P-51s weaving through the skies of the capital, did the reality sink in. He is famously quoted as having said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." While historians note this specific quote may be apocryphal, it perfectly captures the profound shock that paralyzed the Nazi leadership. In that single moment, Goering and his commanders understood that the core assumption of their entire air defense strategy, the invulnerable sanctuary of the German heartland, was a catastrophic illusion. The war in the air had just been lost. The victory over Berlin wasn't an end. It was a beginning. It emboldened the new commander of the 8th Air Force, the famously audacious General James Jimmy Doolittle, to unleash a ruthless new strategy. In January 1944, he issued a revolutionary order that changed everything. The primary mission of his fighters was no longer to simply stay close and protect the bombers. It was to actively seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. This new doctrine was put to a terrifying test during Big Week in late February, a relentless 6-day assault on the German aircraft industry. The new tactics were brutally effective. As Captain John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group described, "We'd escort the bombers to the target, but once they dropped, we'd go looking for trouble. We'd dive to the deck, shoot up airfields, catch German fighters landing or taking off. The goal was no longer parity, it was annihilation." In that 1 week, over 500 German fighters were destroyed. More importantly, the Luftwaffe was being systematically bled of its most valuable and irreplaceable asset, its veteran pilots. The hunters had been unleashed. Doolittle's strategy had turned the air war into a brutal game of arithmetic, and the numbers revealed a German war machine in a state of collapse. The mathematics of attrition were inescapable and horrifying. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,311 pilots. In February, it lost 2,121. In March, another 2,115. These were not just rookies. They were irreplaceable veteran aces, the core of their fighting force. While Germany was hemorrhaging its best, American training programs were producing 11,000 new pilots every single month. This relentless pressure caused the entire German training pipeline to disintegrate. A new Luftwaffe pilot in 1943 had over 250 hours of flight time before seeing combat. By late 1944, with fuel and instructors scarce, they were being sent to the front with as little as 80 hours. In a desperate death spiral, teenage pilots with minimal training were sent up to fight waves of highly trained Americans in superior aircraft. The outcome was a foregone conclusion, written in cold, hard numbers. Germany did have a technological ace up its sleeve, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Capable of 540 miles per hour, it was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustang and could slash through bomber formations with impunity. So why didn't it change the war? Because it was a weapon out of time, a technological marvel facing an industrial tidal wave. As German ace Adolf Galland lamented, "For every Me 262, the Americans had 50 Mustangs. Worse, due to the devastating oil campaign, there was barely any fuel to fly the few jets they had." Mustang pilots also learned to exploit the jet's critical weakness. Its fragile, temperamental engines made it slow and vulnerable during takeoff and landing. American pilots became vultures, circling high above German airfields and waiting to pounce. In a famous example, Lieutenant Urban Drew shot down Tu-262s by catching them in their landing pattern, helpless with their throttles reduced and low on fuel. Even a weapon from the future couldn't save the Luftwaffe when its own airfields had become a death trap. The final, undeniable proof of the Mustang's victory came on the most pivotal day of the war, June 6, 1944. As the largest amphibious invasion in history began on the beaches of Normandy, the skies above should have been a vortex of savage combat. Instead, they were eerily empty. The once mighty Luftwaffe was a ghost. On D-Day, the Allies flew an incredible 14,674 sorties, creating an impenetrable steel umbrella over the invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe, in stark contrast, managed just 319 sorties in response. And over the beaches themselves, where the fate of the war hung in the balance, only 2 lone German fighters appeared. Their pilot later described the mission as a suicidal gesture, surviving only because the Allies were too stunned to react to such a tiny force. The war of attrition, led by the P-51, had so completely shattered German air power that the invasion of Europe proceeded virtually unopposed from the sky. This was the ultimate reward. After the war, the true, devastating impact of the Mustang was confirmed not by Allied victory reports, but by the men who had been defeated by it. Their testimony provides the final, irrefutable verdict on the fighter that broke the Luftwaffe. General Adolf Galland, Germany's commander of fighters, wrote in his memoirs, "The P-51 was perhaps the most significant fighter aircraft of World War II. Until it appeared, we had controlled the timing and tempo of air battles over Germany. After it arrived, we never regained the initiative." Major Heinz Nock, a 33 victory ace, was more blunt. "The Mustang killed the Luftwaffe," he stated. "Not the bomber offensive, not the invasion, but that fighter that could fly to Poland and back. We went from predators to prey in the span of 3 months." Ace Walter Schuck echoed this, stating simply, "We went from laughing at unescorted bombers to taking cover from Mustangs in just 4 months." But the most poignant testimony came from General Johannes Steinhoff. Decades later, his face still bearing the scars from his Me-262 crash, he was asked when he knew the war was lost. He replied, "It was that day in March 1944 when we looked up and saw Mustangs over Berlin. At that moment, every German pilot knew the truth. We had already lost." Beyond its revolutionary range, the Mustang's dominance came from being a complete and optimized weapon system. As German ace Heinz Bahr noted, everything about it was optimized for its mission. This technological edge was clear in every dogfight. In late 1944, it received the K-14 computing gun sight, a gyroscopic marvel that automatically calculated where to aim during a high-speed turn, dramatically improving accuracy. Furthermore, its 6.50 caliber machine guns were fed by a massive load of 1,880 rounds, enough for nearly 30 seconds of continuous fire. A German pilot armed with powerful cannons often had less than 10 seconds of ammunition. This meant American pilots could afford to take shots their enemies couldn't. This superior system, produced on a staggering scale with over 15,000 aircraft built, was the ultimate product of American industrial might. In October 1943, the skies over Germany echoed with the laughter of confident Luftwaffe pilots as they shot down American bombers at will. Less than 5 months later, when Mustangs appeared over Berlin on March 4, 1944, that laughter stopped forever. The transformation from predator to prey was not gradual. It was a catastrophic and complete reversal. The pilots who had laughed in 1943 were by 1945 refusing to fly missions, and the Luftwaffe itself had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. In the end, the P-51 Mustang was more than just the aircraft that won the air war. It was the physical embodiment of a superior system, a weapon that shattered the dangerous myth of German invincibility and proved that victory came not from ideology, but from industrial capacity, international cooperation, and democratic innovation.